Hello everybody and welcome to this discussion between me, Declan Henry, and Sheikh Asrar Rashid. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a writer and researcher and author of 8 books, including Voices of Modern Islam, What It Means to be Muslim Today. Sheikh Asrar Rashid is a renowned imam, Islamic scholar, teacher and author who's based here in Birmingham in the UK. Today's discussion is about Islam and homosexuality. Homosexuality is considered a major sin in Islam and is punishable in some Muslim majority countries by death under Sharia law. To the vast majority of Muslims, homosexuality is a moral disorder. Let me read that last line again. Homosexuality is a moral disorder. Sheikh Rashid, what's your opinion of this?
Well, of course, Declan, my initiating point, my standpoint would be from the moral, with regard to the morality of homosexuality would be from the principles of Islam. And the teachings of Islam are based on the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Morality for us is defined by God. So, unlike secular law, which is experiment, laws change with time and place as time progresses, laws undergo modification, including morality. In Islam, we do not have that concept. Good and bad is ultimately defined by God. So the human mind is insufficient to determine whether something is good or bad. We need divine revelation, and we always resort to divine revelation. Not what you would think, what some would refer to as clergy determining what the meaning of certain texts are. If the text is very clear, like the prohibition of alcohol or the prohibition of gambling and the prohibition of adultery, all these things are very clear. They do not need a clergy to define what is haram, halal, what is prohibited.
And of course, these issues are very clear in the Quran.
Yes, so homosexuality is clearly prohibited in the Quran and in the Hadith.
Okay, well, I think we need to expand a little bit on this. So tell me about what are the teachings in the Quran that say homosexuality is wrong.
Firstly, you have the story of Lut alayhi salam, which is the Prophet Lot, which is found in the Bible, and the condemnation of the people of Lut for having this practice of homosexuality, which we would say what you mentioned in the death penalty or capital punishment for homosexuality is really, if you reword that as being public display, that changes the entire paradigm, how you view the actual punishment in itself.
But would I be correct in saying that it doesn't explicitly mention the word homosexuality?
What it mentions is the sexual act, meaning shahwatan min duni nisa, that you approach men, shahwatan min duni nisa, not approaching women, meaning sexually approaching men. That's clearly prohibited in the Quran. And through in terms of Islamic schools having various interpretations in Islamic law, this is something agreed upon across the board regarding the act of homosexuality being prohibited, to the extent that a man committing sodomy with his wife is also prohibited in the Sunni schools. So if sodomy between a man and his wife is prohibited, then a forty or it's prohibited with a man and a man.
Am I correct in my research that there's loosely homosexuality is referred to in the Quran around 7 times?
Well, wherever the story of Lut, the Prophet Lut is mentioned, the act is referred to.
Now, the reason that I say 7 times is that, there are many other things in the Quran that are mentioned several times. So if it's only mentioned 7 times and it's rather loosely mentioned, would that be an indication that it hasn't that God, I suppose, didn't place an enormous amount of emphasis on
That
it?
would be incorrect, because theft, for instance, is mentioned once.
Right.
So the verse "Asariqu wasariqatu faqta'u aydiyahuma," it mentions a punishment for theft only once in the Quran.
Yeah.
Secondly, the punishment that was given to the people of Lut is mentioned within the Quran, and it's mentioned with harsh wording. Meaning, but remember one thing: the Quran, in its wordings, sometimes the Quran will mention, for instance, when a person goes and relieves himself from the toilet, that the Quran doesn't use explicit language. You do not find foul language in the Quran. Nowhere in the Quran is there. Like for instance, in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says with regard to approaching one's wife on the nights of fasting, فَأْتُوا حَرْثَكُمْ أَنَّا شِئْتُمْ. Approach your cultivation how you want to approach. Having sex with one's wife is referred to as cultivation. So that's the language of the Quran. It doesn't use vulgar or explicit language with regard to the sexual act.
I wouldn't expect it to.
Or with regard to, unlike the Bible you have explicit language in the Bible.
But going back to the opening point, if Muslims consider homosexuality to be a moral disorder, and it is mentioned in the Quran loosely 7 times, but the Quran doesn't endorse a punishment for homosexuality.
I wouldn't say it's mentioned loosely in the Quran. It's mentioned.
Well, it's not mentioned. Really, do you think that it's explicit? Because
explicit enough in the sense that, as I mentioned to you, how the sexual act is referred to in the Quran, the homosexual act is referred to in the Quran also, and also the punishment of the people of Lut is mentioned in harsh terms, meaning that they were punished for that act.
But it doesn't endorse punishment though for homosexuality.
And what you refer to is the corporal punishment, the Islamic law. So that's something else. So the Islamic law with regard to the homosexual act is actually disputed.
But the Quran would be quite clear about the punishment for adultery.
No. So with the punishment for fornication out of wedlock is mentioned explicitly in the Quran, but the punishment for adultery is not mentioned in the Quran. It's mentioned in the Hadith, which mentions the stoning. So stoning is not mentioned in the Quran. Stoning for the adultery is mentioned in the Hadith. So the absence of something being not mentioned in the Quran doesn't entail it's not there. With regard to the corporal punishment on homosexuals, that's something you'll find details of a dispute of the nature of the punishment. So the dropping from a height, the burning, all these things are actually disputed. So the jurists have different positions on the actual punishment. So your initial question, starting from the morality.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to mention that there are differences in the different schools of thought.
Yes.
Around that. But let's talk a little bit about the Hadith. You've mentioned the Quran and where it's mentioned in the Quran. Tell me about the Hadith, bearing in mind that the Quran is the primary source. It's the undiluted direct word of God. The Hadith obviously is different. So tell me where
the Hadith, what is mentioned in the Hadith explicitly is with regard to the action, which is referred to as a lawata, which is the act of sodomy, being prohibited. It's deemed a sin. Sodomy, irrelevant to whether it's between a man and woman or whether it's between a man and a man.
Yes, absolutely.
It's prohibited.
Yeah.
So the act of sodomy is prohibited in the Hadith with explicit wording, meaning there's no doubt on this, to the point that all 4 Sunni schools, they prohibit a married couple from even committing that sexual act. So if it's prohibited for a man and woman, it's prohibited for a man and man.
But I suppose here in the UK, we see horrific stories in the media about Sharia law. In countries like Afghanistan and Iran, people being gay people being pushed off buildings and so on and so forth in the name of Sharia law. Can you expand a little bit on that?
So with regard to Sharia law in the modern age, so you have the post-Ottoman Caliphate age, you have nation states. So we have over 50 Muslim nation states. Nation states tend to utilize Sharia law for authoritarianism. So aspects of Sharia law are implemented in societies where the entire Sharia law is not implemented. Aspects of Sharia law are implemented. Because if you had total Sharia law, you wouldn't have the concept of a nation state. Because the Sharia law is applied in a caliphate, and caliphate is beyond a racial group, an ethnicity. So the application of Sharia law today in all the nation states is selective. So the court procedures.
Well, it certainly is because, as I said, we read about these horrific stories from time to time of people being pushed off buildings. We don't really hear about people being stoned to death for adultery. It seems to be particularly harsh for gay people.
No, in Iran you do have stonings. They do stone adulterers. You can check statistics. You'll find adulterers stoned, and it's very regular.
So you would say that they're not as harsh for gay people, or it's parallel.
To tell the truth,
it's parallel to people who commit adultery.
The Islamic law, as it stands, is an application of hudud, of corporal punishments, on sexual display. So sexual display is beyond homosexuals. It applies to everyone. So if there's a public display of the sexual act of coitus in public, that is punished. But if there is, the Sharia law doesn't intervene on people's private lives. So in Sharia law, it's prohibited. For instance, spying is not permitted unless it's for security of the people. But in general, if Zayd and Bakr are up to no good acts in their private lives, the Sharia law cannot intervene in that. So the application of the hudud, which is the corporal punishments, is only on public display and very difficult to apply in the first place.
Well, it would be because, correct me if I'm wrong, you've got to have 4 witnesses.
Yes.
So you would have to have 4 witnesses that would have witnessed the homosexual act, or?
Well, with regard to the homosexual act, what some of the jurists, they state is that the punishment of an adulterer is applied on the homosexual. So the same stringent conditions, which is not only an observation of the act, it's also an explicit observation. So when you read the entry of the private organ, all that needs to be observed, and that's very rarely occurs, if it occurs at all. So even if they find a man and a woman naked, it's insufficient to apply the stoning. So the conditions for stoning are very stringent.
But do you think that they always keep to that? Do you think that they're honourable and that they keep to...
So that would come down to court procedures.
Yeah.
So the corruption of a state, what is the level of corruption?
Okay, yeah.
How is the law applied? How does the police who go and arrest the supposed criminals, how do they apply the law? How the procedure in the court, the judges, how they analyze the case? All of this needs to be out in the open. I'll tell you something unique about Islamic law. Theoretically today, because it's not applied in its correct form, but in the past history, it was always an open application. Open application in the sense that, like today, we have with the public gallery, the public could go and see the application of the law, how the qadi, the judge, is actually applying the law. So there must be a fairness in application. So whether these countries like Iran, which I deem as a more of a nationalist state as opposed to an Islamic state in the correct application of Islamic law, how do they actually apply those punishments? Because in the 1980s, after Khomeini's revolution, they even punished many of the Revolutionary Guard and people who were close to Khomeini. They were punished, and the application of the law and how they interpreted Sharia law, all of that needs to be critiqued, and
it needs a review.
A review from an independent body, meaning a Muslim
independent
body.
Because I believe in what you're saying, that some of it has become corrupted.
Corrupted, and post the Ottoman Caliphate, there's not been a more entrenched historical application of Islam post the Ottomans, because the Ottomans underwent reforms in the 1800s, which was known as the Tanzimat. post the Ottomans, there's not been a correct application of Sharia law as it should be, as it is found in the Quran and Sunnah.
Now, we've mentioned the countries, or I'm going to mention the countries now. I mean, there are 66 in my research around the world, that are mainly Muslim who criminalize same-sex relationships. And out of that, there are 11 countries, again, mainly Muslim, who retain the death penalty for LGBT plus people. I suppose my question to you, Sheikh Asrar, is do you think homosexuality should be criminalized in every country, including Britain?
And before going on to that, what you mentioned with regard to capital punishment for LGBT people, this would need, the statement would need more defining. The application of death would only apply on practicing homosexuals in the sense that they carry out the act, and as I said, in the sense of a public display of the act.
So they would have to have 4 witnesses.
So in many countries like Pakistan, for instance, there are people who are homosexually inclined, but the punishment is not carried out on such people, or they have a culture.
Because there's no witnesses.
There's no witnesses, and also there's a culture of cross-dressing. In Pakistan, they have a culture of cross-dressing. Those people are tolerated. They are not punished under Islamic law, even though Islam prohibits cross-dressing. There's no necessary punishment mentioned with regard to cross-dressers. The ruler is free to establish what they refer to as ta'zir laws. Ta'zir laws means if he feels there's a need to apply a fine or an imprisonment, he has the right to do so, but no such thing has been done. So this movement of LGBT, we as Muslims, we do not agree with the movement in the sense that how they frame these things doesn't apply to us in the first place.
And I don't think that there are any statistics to, out of those 11 countries. I can't quote you statistics, the number of people that would have, had the death penalty imposed upon them. I don't think those statistics are available.
With regard to your question,
about criminalization.
Yeah. So, for instance, living in Britain is more or less a secular country in practice. In theory, of course, we have the Church of England and the heritage of Henry VIII. But nevertheless, the country is secular. So the standpoint, meaning the starting point of any country, is from its basis. So the basis of this country is secular. So I wouldn't expect Britain to ban homosexuality, but what I would demand from the British people is that you must believe in the Quran and Islam, and I preach therefore Islam to everyone from the king to the common bus driver, that you should become Muslim for your own salvation. From that standpoint, once they become Muslim, if Charles becomes a Muslim or the Prime Minister and the Constitution changes, then you would expect the country to apply Islamic law. But the very discussions as it stands, it's a secular country. So my standpoint would be they first need to become Muslim, as opposed to criminalizing just one thing, which doesn't really apply. So homosexuality for a non-Muslim living in a secular country, there's no prohibition in the first place because he doesn't believe in God from the onset.
But you may also think that even if homosexuality was criminalized here in the UK, it doesn't stop it. If you look at the statistics for the 66 countries,
the act doesn't stop the same way that alcoholism doesn't stop, gambling doesn't stop, theft doesn't stop, homosexuality doesn't stop. If you look at the Sharia law, it's not actually stopping the act itself, it's stopping a public display of such things. So the public display is stopped. It's safeguarding the public. Unlike this LGBT movement.
Well, you need to expand a little bit on the public display, because how many people are going to go around and have homosexual acts in public?
Well, for instance, an LGBT march would be banned in an Islamic. Actually,
well, they wouldn't be having sex. There wouldn't be any sexual display.
But
in a gay pride march.
In gay pride would be a promotion of. It's like having a march for promoting alcohol in an Islamic country.
But you could have that and not be drinking the alcohol.
Yes, but the promotion of such things would be prohibited as well.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. I suppose the next question, and it's quite a burning question, is: do you think Muslims, based on what we've spoken about so far, do you think that Muslims are intrinsically homophobic? Is there high levels of homophobia?
Like you get this term anti-Semitism, and today it's applied to Muslims. In fact, anti-Semitism is a European illness, but it's applied to Muslims today because of the illegal state of Israel. So similarly, homophobia, I would say, is more of a Western thing. In the Islamic tradition, there was no such thing known as homophobia, meaning if there's someone drinking alcohol, we don't call him, and people dislike the act, we don't refer to it as a wine phobia, alcoholic phobia, or
Or would you say that most Muslims dislike homosexuals?
they dislike the act.
They dislike the act.
The act.
Okay.
And they would dislike the militant LGBT activist who attempts to brainwash young kids and make them more accepting of his lifestyle, because we're not tolerant to that.
So would you say there are high levels of homophobia in Muslim communities?
No, not really.
Not really?
No.
Okay. Could you expand a little bit on that?
So if a homosexual came into the masjid, he prayed his prayer, that's not really homophobia. Homophobia would mean that if they know of a homosexual assaulting him physically or insulting him with verbal swears or not permitting him into the masjid, none of that occurs as far as I'm aware.
Okay. And would you say that we've talked about the theology in relation to homosexuality? Would you say that a lot of views that Muslims have about homosexuality is based on traditions, culture, rather than actual theological teachings?
Yes. So how people view a homosexual will be influenced by their cultural background, no doubt. So from different regions, some regions people are more tolerant, in other regions less tolerant. But the teachings
Could you
of
give me
Islam are very clear.
give me an example on that?
There are certain countries where the men may be more inclining towards a bisexual behavior, and there are certain countries where that would be totally intolerable.
What country are we talking about here?
Without mentioning any countries, because many people will be offended if I mention some of those countries.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, no, that's absolutely fine. You say people would be offended to name a
Because they will
particular
see
country.
a contradiction between Islam, the teachings of Islam, and that behavior.
Okay. I suppose in my experience, when I was writing my book on Islam, and obviously I went around to meet lots of imams and went to various mosques, and when I raised this subject about LGBT issues, amongst many other topics, I was met with a silence, and I was told stories that, we don't talk about LGBT issues, we don't talk about gay Muslims, we don't like talking about subjects like that in our mosques. And I was left with the impression that there is a lot of silence in UK mosques on sensitive issues. I mean, not exclusively to issues pertaining to LGBT and gay people, but particularly that there's a silence that people just feel very uncomfortable talking about.
Well, every week I tour various mosques of the UK, and I openly discuss LGBT amongst many other things. The younger generation, when I say younger, anyone under 40, very vocal. They're very vocal on these issues. We speak about these issues. The way me and you are discussing, we discuss this in open Q&As in the masajid.
Which is a good thing, isn't it?
Of course. But I think the lack of people engaging in this subject may be due to not being able to, having the ability to engage on the subject, or having
of course,
an in-depth
age, level of education, culture. There are so many issues that come into that. Yeah.
Yes.
But do you think that older imams are less equipped to deal with sensitive modern day subjects like this?
Yes, because what's happened in the past decade, you have these strange movements like red pill, black pill, incels, LGBT, All of these things. There's a bombardment of various types of movements, and
but it's necessary to talk about them, isn't it?
of course,
Yeah.
and as Muslims in the past always took the bull by the horns. Today, we as Muslims should take the bull, the LGBT bull, the Zionist bull. Not to say they're the same, but various types of
Confronted.
bulls. Confront these bulls and take them by the horns, and with our methodology of kalam, which is the science, our Islamic theology method, take on these bulls and give our Islamic stance. But remember one thing, which is important to highlight: how the LGBT movement frames its position in the Western world is not the same as it should be framed in the Muslim context. Like I say always, that the Muslims didn't need a suffragette movement because the women already had property rights, inheritance rights. So the way women's rights were tackled in the Muslim world are different to the Western experience. And the same with anti-Semitism, the same with LGBT and other issues that may arise.
Obviously, you said yourself you go around and you discuss these issues in various mosques, and obviously you're a teacher and you come in contact with lots of young people, and obviously you know that there's young Muslims born here in the UK or educated in the UK who have access to social media platforms. They're very well versed on these type of issues. But going back to the older imams, mosques throughout the UK, communities that would, for Friday prayers, that would have, between 200 and 300, men to come for Friday prayers. They have to bear in mind that at least 10%, whether, if it's 200 people who come for Friday prayers, at least 20 of those men.
Less than 10%.
Less than 10%, but let's say an average 10% if we take into account gay men and bisexual men. That's quite a number. It's quite a number to say, to stay silent on.
No, the mosques, the imams should not stay silent. What they should have is a counter narrative. So we have our narrative, our Islamic narrative. So what I tell young people when I go to the various masajid with regard to LGBT, I say, firstly, exercise your freedom of speech in schools. Why are we being silent? Why are we being silenced in schools? So young people should wear t-shirts which say, I have the freedom to exercise my freedom of speech. Because Muslims are silenced on political issues and on moral issues, on ethical issues. So we have our freedom to exercise our freedom of speech to say homosexuality is immoral, meaning that's our standpoint. To validate that standpoint, we can speak from logic, we can speak from our scriptures, and from any other philosophical method in order to give our point of view. Thirdly, I say to them in school, always ask the teachers, can you inform us with regard to the various STDs associated with the homosexual act? Because that's not taught as much as it should be. Fourthly, what are the harms that are associated with the act, the homosexual act, in terms of AIDS, HIV, the breakdown of the immune system, men wearing nappies in their older age? Can you inform us with regard to this? That's not being homophobic, meaning a young man who's brainwashed into thinking that homosexuality is totally tolerable when he's 14 or 15, and then by the time he reaches 50s, he's wearing nappies. He should be informed of this, that this act does.
Educate me, why would he be wearing nappies?
Because sometimes the act of sodomy, excessive sodomy, sometimes leads to
well, that's provided that they engage in anal sex.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So, meaning young people should be informed of this, all of these things as well. And then body dysphoria, this extreme of young people being told to have their genitals removed and take all these various types of medicines and pills.
Well, we'll just come on to that in a little while. We'll talk about transgender people a bit, but let's stick at this particular point because obviously you're mentioning young people. in my experience, in my research, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because you perhaps have more access to young Muslims than I have. I've discovered that there are numerous social media platforms for young LGBT people here in the UK, more so in the last 5 years than ever before. So obviously these are the type of issues that they will be discussing. I mean, they're aware of all these issues about sexual transmitted diseases and so on and so forth, but they want to pursue with their sexuality.
Well,
they want. Let me finish on this, because what I've discovered is that they that they're coming to terms with being gay, that they still want to be Muslim, they still want to practice their religion, that they're no longer sticking around waiting for tolerance, that they want acceptance. They want acceptance now. They want respect. They want gay-friendly mosques. They're not waiting around for some imam or some mosque or community to accept them. They have found acceptance in their own network. And that there's a little bit of a mini revolution taking place here in the UK that will probably become more visible in the years to come. Well, when I say years to come, in the next 3 to 5 years.
Well, what type of homo tolerance do they want in the masajid? They want the wudu place be turned pink? Meaning, what do they want?
I don't think they do. I don't think they want to change anything. I don't think that they want to change any of the theological teachings whatsoever.
They are not stopped from praying in the masajid in the first place. There's no masjid that has a banner that no homosexuals can pray.
No, I know that. I know that.
But secondly, if, for instance, us inner city Muslims, we have a drug problem. We have drug dealers, and they deal drugs everywhere. If they tomorrow started a movement, they would have more power than this homosexual movement. And if they said to us, we need you to tolerate us because we have a choice to smoke cannabis, or the number of cannabis smokers we have in the Muslim community, if they made a movement and said people like Sheikh Asrar should tolerate cannabis smokers, and we're going to make a movement, it wouldn't make any difference. It wouldn't make any difference. It wouldn't change an iota of anything. The theological stance will stay the same. The difference here is that in the West we have this thing where a certain act creates a lifestyle. So, and that you don't.
And they want to be part of this lifestyle.
So the LGBT is not just the homosexual act. It's being a part of what they refer to as a community.
Yes, absolutely.
And
yeah.
at the same time remain Muslim.
Yeah.
Well, the choice is very simple. If someone
want both.
If someone wants to be a part of the LGBT community and take it on as a lifestyle, they leave the fold of Islam. And
this new generation, that's where the big challenge will come, because they want to be part of both communities.
It's like having a perennialist who believes Christianity is right and Islam is right at the same time. So we cannot.
It's a little bit different from that.
It is different.
I'm not saying whether this is right or whether this is wrong. This is what I'm seeing. I'm seeing the emergence of this.
Like I said, we take the bull by its horns and tackle it theologically, meaning there's no theological validation for such a stance.
No, I get your point, but I don't think that they're out for a challenge. I just think that they have come to it. What I'm seeing is they're coming to accept their sexuality. They want to remain Muslim. Before, you're right. I think maybe even up until a couple of years ago, probably still relevant to the current day, is you had two choices. If you were gay, you either stayed within the folds of Islam or you left. I think that this is a new way of thinking.
So
you can have both.
The position
without challenge.
Let's say someone says he's a homosexual, a practicing homosexual, and a Muslim. He would be deemed as a sinful Muslim. So, but as soon as someone says the act of homosexuality is permitted, they leave the fold of Islam.
Well, I suppose their argument to that would be, I have made my peace with God. God created me.
In terms of their sin.
Yeah, this is between me and God. I will let God judge me. Not some imam, not some mosque.
Where we would stand there is if there is an alcoholic, he drinks alcohol, and he's a Muslim, he's a sinful Muslim, ultimate judgment is with Allah.
Absolutely.
Yes?
Yeah.
There's a homosexual, he believes he is sinning, but ultimate judgment is with Allah. We do not go around like some of these Christian.
I would correct you there. I think the new generation of young British Muslims, gay Muslims who are practicing, they won't think that it's sinful. That's the difference.
So that's where theologically we can explain to them that they've left the fold of Islam, at least from a theological basis. And if they disagree,
I think
they can continue disagreeing. That's what we refer to as moral relativism. It leads to this, because if there tomorrow a movement grows where a person believes incest is permitted, and they say there's no clear proof for incest being haram, being prohibited, and they make a movement and say, look, we are Muslim, but we permit incest as long as they are two consensual adults, and they may use contraception, and they say, look, incest is permitted, and they make a movement. It doesn't change our theology at all. Or if there's a movement that says...
I totally agree with you. I'm not disagreeing with you here, but I'm just saying that from my research, that this new generation that's coming, that they're not out to change anything. They're not out to challenge you.
Well, we've had movements in the past. Islamically, you read Islamic history from 1400 years. We've had numerous movements. They come and go. 70 years from now, this movement, whether it will be around or not, we will see.
Yeah. At the moment, would it be fair to say that for gay people in Islam that there is a policy, don't ask, don't tell? Would you agree with that or not?
No, not really. Regularly, young people who are homosexuals, they do ask the question, and they inform the imams that they are homosexual. And
would you say that those are quite brave? Brave in the sense that if you divulge your sexuality, that you open yourself up, you're exposed to conversion therapy?
No, in Islam we don't have a conversion therapy. We just simply tell the person, desist from the act. For instance, a man has a desire to sleep around with women. Mm-hmm. It's a natural desire. Mm-hmm. But in Islam we tell him, you must desist from this and receive reward with God. So the man stops womanizing. Similarly, a man has desire for men. He's told, do not act upon that desire, you will have reward with God. But we don't sit with him with the hypnotism and giving them chemicals and none of that. No,
I wasn't suggesting because again,
self-discipline.
Again, in my research, I discovered that there were probably two types of response. The first response is the rejection. Look, there's no such thing as a religious homosexual. People who have come out, they've been told that they're deviants, they're sinners. You have no place. That lifestyle has no place in Islam. You better leave. That's the kind of the first response. The second response that a lot of people seem to have received is what would appear to be a more sympathetic response. Almost empathizing with the person, saying, "Well, actually, you have an affliction.
It is an affliction.
We can pray together. You can get over this." They've been told, there's no such thing as a person who's 100% homosexual. Let's say, for argument's sake, you're 70% homosexual. That means there's 30% of you that's heterosexual. We can work with that 30%. You can see an Islamic counselor, therapist, who will help you overcome the affliction. You can get married, you can have children, and when you do these things, those feelings, those thoughts that you have, those deviant thoughts, they will all go away and you will be fine. Well, is that not a form of conversion therapy?
The person who stays celibate and fights the desire is rewarded. So he's not a sinful person for the thoughts. The fact that he resists to act upon those thoughts, he would be rewarded, and even if he dies celibate, he would in fact die as a person with immense reward and a high station with God. So homosexuals, this is the best response I can give, have a chance to get closer to God if they do not disobey God than many straight people. So that affliction is a means to get closer to God. They don't need to go through any thought reform or any of this therapy, but just desist from the act.
So would you say that there wouldn't be imams, in your experience, that would advise people to get married in the hope that it would...
There may be some
their
imams
sexual
who give that
orientation,
advice, but sometimes I
Would that be wrong advice?
I would advise them sometimes not to give that advice. Why?
Okay.
Because there are people who then live double lives. So if there is a person who has 100% desire for people of the same sex, the advice given to them is to remain celibate, desist from the act. You will receive a high station with God, higher than many straight people.
Yeah.
So that desire being placed in them, and then that person desisting from the act, he will have so much reward with God. Like some people have other deviant desires. If they don't act on those deviant desires, meaning worse than homosexuality, they don't act on that desire, they will have a reward with God.
Yeah. Now, obviously, a lot of our discussion so far has been about gay men and bisexual men. I mean, female homosexuality, lesbians, am I correct in saying that they're not mentioned in the Quran and that they're only briefly hinted at in the Hadith? They get off a little bit lightly, don't they?
There is a mention of them in the Quran with regard to the women. There is one verse relating to that. And they are mentioned in the Hadith. They are mentioned in the Hadith. In terms of corporal punishments, that again is disputed in the books of fiqh and there. But as you said, not as explicitly as homosexuals.
And what advice is there out there? I mean, obviously, you do a lot of work with young people, and you said that you meet a lot of young people who may be questioning their sexuality, or you give talks in general about sexuality. I mean, what sort of work would take place within Muslim communities for young females who would be in the similar position
the
to
same
young males?
as the males, in the sense that desisting from the act is rewardable. Because if someone cannot fight that desire, I mean the desire doesn't go, then the reward that person has is immense. That the fact that they remain celibate, they stay away from sex. I mean, you have straight people who all their lives they remain celibate and they die celibate. So the same is applied to people who claim that they have 100% desire for only men or people of the same sex. And then they must remain celibate and receive an immense reward with God. That's the only solution. But by making a counter movement of, permitting homosexuality under the framework of Islam, this takes them out of the fold of Islam. It's like making a rights movement for alcoholics in Islam. That's how it's viewed.
And what would your views be about transgender people? Obviously, it's a different area in the sense that it's predominantly about gender. It's about people who are who want to change their gender, who say that their gender is
they need therapy, definitely.
They dispute that they're not the gender that they were assigned at birth.
Well, theologically, that's totally wrong, and I believe they need therapy. It's a form of what I mentioned to you as body dysphoria. So what we're witnessing now, young people being told, you may get a young woman, a young girl, she's a bit of a tomboy, and then she's made to think that she's a boy. But in later life, she realizes she went through a phase, and then she realizes she is in fact a woman. But to make her take different chemicals and change her genitalia, this is a form of abuse. This is something that I would want the government here to change the laws with regard to.
But as you know, there has been a tsunami of change in the transgender debate in recent years, and more people, maybe not necessarily Muslims, but more and more people here in the UK are coming out as transgender, and in particularly young people who are coming out as non-binary. I mean, what's your opinion of that? Do you think that could actually take hold?
I think there will be a backlash to this in the long run. a generation to come, they'll realize the mistake that they are doing.
Because if this is an issue for non-Muslims,
Where does it stop?
why would it not be an issue for Muslims?
Because I've heard of this stuff of fluffies as well, something they refer to as fluffies. People think they're animals. People think they have a right to refer to themselves as cats. It's stupidity. It doesn't need any tolerance in Islam. We don't tolerate that. That's nonsense. A young person speaks up in the masjid and says, "Look, I think I'm a bird or I'm a cat."
No, I agree with you. I agree with you on
gender.
that.
If he's a boy, I'm going to say you're a boy.
Yeah.
If he's a man, I'm going to say you're a man.
But these are people who don't accept the gender that they were assigned at birth.
Yeah, it's stupidity.
You know,
I don't agree with that at all.
but there are transgender Muslims in the world.
Yes. So in the hadith, the Prophet said, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, peace be upon him, that with regard to men dressing as women and women dressing as men is something prohibited in Islam. It's not permissible. So the person who does that is sinful.
What would your, I mean, those are your views and you're entitled to those views. You know, I agree very much in free speech, but there will be people watching this that would say, well, actually, the sheikh's views are very transphobic. No, we talked about homophobia.
Well, transphobic, again, if what they mean by phobia is me stating that what the religion of Islam states with regard to a man dressing as a woman.
Well, they say they would say that that's direct discrimination against the trans community. There's a fear, there's a loathing there of trans people.
No, there's no loathing of any human. It's prohibited in Islam. If the person asks me, I'll say it's prohibited in our deen. It doesn't mean that the person is assaulted or insulted or anything else what you refer to as intolerance or treated any differently. So, for instance,
well, you're a well-educated man, and obviously you're a very diplomatic man. I would question if everybody that every imam would be as capable of dealing with these issues that you are.
For instance, I'm a Muslim shopkeeper. A transgender person comes and buys something or delivers my shopping. There's no transphobic behavior towards that person. He's a human being. Mm-hmm. But if the person asks me, what does your deen, your religion say with regard to this act, I'll say it's prohibited. Mm-hmm. And I will always give you the example of an alcoholic mm-hmm. or a gambler. Mm-hmm. If there's a guy, he's gambling away, he's gambling all his wealth away. I'll tolerate him. I won't show any phobia towards him. But if he asks me, what's your position on gambling, I'll say it's prohibited in our deen. Mm-hmm. So that cannot be interpreted as being transphobic in the sense if there's a transgender person walking down the road and people assault him or insult him. You'll find there's a high level of tolerance in many Muslim communities more than other communities. Like transgenders in Pakistan. They have whole communities of, they refer to them as kusre.
Yes. Yeah.
And they are left alone.
Yeah.
No one really harms them.
Yeah.
So if they mean by transphobia, that's not found in that sense. So this is what I mean by the way the suffragettes movement had its framework to work within the Victorian times. The LGBT movement here in the West has its Western framework. Fighting for gay rights in the Muslim world would need a total different angle, a total different.
No, and I understand that, and I understand your viewpoint as a religious man. But I suppose there are those that would accuse Muslims in your position of being homophobic and transphobic,
yes,
because they'd say they're hiding behind their religion.
That's because.
But I do get your point.
That's basically what I refer to that as. Like you have cyberbullying, you have this type of bullying now. The Zionists do this on the regular by using anti-Semitism card. Zionists use the anti-Semitism card. And people, I could easily say, oh, you're Islamophobic now, which is probably not the case. Let's say there's someone who says about me I'm transphobic, and I respond to them by saying, you're Islamophobic. When in reality, they cannot engage in the philosophical discussion. The philosophical discussion would start from moral relativism. How do you define morality? Define to me your sources of morality. And I will give you my sources of morality. Are your sources of morality from the mind, or are they from religious scripture? Meaning, when we go deep into the discussion, I think when they cannot go deep enough, then they just use these labels. Oh, he's just homophobic, or he's just transphobic. And similarly, a Muslim could easily do the same. You're just Islamophobic. All of this would be false.
No, I get your point on that. Tell me, and we're coming to the last few questions now. Tell me, parents. What advice would you give to parents if they were watching this today? Parents who've just discovered that their son or daughter is either homosexual or lesbian, or indeed transgender. I mean, what advice would you give to a parent who's just discovered that their child thinks that they're a member of the LGBT community?
Again, when you say LGBT community, how would you define a community? Meaning, your child making the choice to join a community.
Well, they
have no children of their own. These LGBT people, they have no children of their own.
No, well, let me explain that. Maybe that was. Let me just explain that. I suppose that sometimes before a child comes and tells their parent, they may have they've lived with that secret for a while, and they may be friends with other gay and lesbian people, and especially in the social media platforms. So therefore, they probably do feel that they are part of that social media LGBT platform, so that they do come and then they tell their parents.
The problem I have with this concept of an LGBT community is that they target the children of others, online grooming or whatever, or brainwashing.
But that's not the question. Again, just go back. If you're a parent here and you've just discovered, or your child has just discovered that they're gay or lesbian, what advice would you give to that parent?
Firstly, the parent should re-examine how they raise their child, in the sense of informing their children. If the schools have information campaigns of informing young people of LGBT, of all these things, then we as Muslims should have the counter narrative in our mosques, in our homes. We should give the counter narratives to our young children. So they need to re-examine that. Secondly, they need to pray to Allah, that Allah guide their child back to the straight path and realize the error of their ways, and inform their child that, look, if you desist from this act.
What do you mean by the error of their ways?
If they decide to join an LGBT so-called community.
Well, they'll say that's where we find acceptance.
Well, acceptance.
God created me this way. Everybody else rejects me. I feel I belong in that community.
What they mean by acceptance here is acceptance of doing that act. Acceptance of fulfilling their desires.
They mightn't have done any act.
If they don't do any act, then the parent tells them, we tolerate you as you are, as long as you don't carry out the act and permit the act. Meaning, it's not permissible in Islam. Desist from it, you will receive a high reward. So we go back to what I said. The parent should inform them, look, by not acting on this, you're receiving great, immense reward. You are tolerated. You have that desire.
No, and I get all that, and obviously that's going back to the theological teachings again. But on a social level, on a human level, how do you think the parents should deal with this?
Well, depending on the particular case, if the child decides to leave Islam and be a practicing homosexual, then in that case, the parents should continue attempting to convince the child of the error of their ways. In the long run, the person may realize the error of their ways.
Or he or she might be a member of this new group that's going to emerge in the next couple of years, that's going to bear fruit, that will say that they're who will want to be a practicing homosexual or lesbian and remain within the fold of Islam.
Well, that group...
You're only giving them one choice. What if there are two choices?
That group is inept, theologically inept, meaning it's very vacuous. It's a vacuous claim. It's an absurd group. It's like having these fuzzies, meaning it's just absurd. It doesn't really pose any long-term threat to anything.
Well...
No, it's not.
You might have to wait and see on that one. No, going back, obviously, so that's the advice you would give to parents. Again, final question. What would you, if there was a young person, a young 14, 15-year-old watching this, male, female, what advice would you give to a young person who was going through that conflict, internal conflict, that they thought that they were gay or lesbian? What advice would
I
you
would
give to them?
advise them that as Muslims, our very starting point is what is known as ubudiyah, servitude to Allah. So our very existence has a purpose. That purpose is obedience to Allah. So obedience to Allah overwhelms any of our desires, meaning every human has desires, but overwhelming that desire for the sake of Allah will bring you closer to Allah. So in life you have a choice. You either adopt, you live according to your desires, unbridled, or you live according to the law of Allah. You have the law of man and you have the law of Allah. What do we promote? We promote the law of Allah, not the law of man, which changes from time to place. When something suits them, they eat fetuses in China, meaning they permit people to eat fetus. That's something immutable, meaning Islamic law is immutable, the morality is immutable. It doesn't change from time to place. Just because a community forms to validate a particular desire, we don't change our morality based on that.
But don't you think that most young Muslims will already have heard that they'll already have received the lesson on that, and it hasn't changed a thing?
No, you'd be surprised how many people are even unaware of such a basic concept.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
You'd be surprised. And when they hear this for the first time, it really changes their outlook, how they view life.
So if they hear that, before hearing that, they could think that they were gay or lesbian in their sexual orientation, and you think that could actually be the changing point?
It's an issue of iman, belief, and kufr, meaning which one do you go with? It's a choice. Ultimately, it's a choice. La ikraha fi deen. There is no compulsion in the deen. What does that mean? You cannot force your conviction on another person, even if ostensibly they pretend to be a Muslim, and what we refer to as munafiqs, hypocrites. They pretend to be Muslim, they don't really believe in it. They will be in the lowest pits of hellfire.
Yeah.
So don't be a munafiq, don't be a hypocrite, but if you think with your mind and not solely with your desires, do we follow the law of Allah or do we follow the law of man? Or morality, what is our source of morality? Is it man or is it God?
Do you think that young people, and indeed parents, is kind of a joint question, do you think that they're always met with kindness or a little bit of understanding, empathy? Or do you think that it's quite harsh, that they have to be taught the theological teachings, and that harsh lesson has to be first and foremost?
I think the harshness is sometimes necessary.
Right. Okay.
Because you're directing your child's life. What direction are they going to?
Right.
In which direction are they heading? So if a child comes home with drugs, he comes home with alcohol, he comes home with a gambling addiction,
But
he's a womanizer.
Just stick with this issue.
And he comes as a homosexual, they will treat it the same.
Yeah. So the harsh approach.
There's no difference. Harsh, depending what you mean by harsh, in the sense that son, do not do this act, desist from the act. It's intolerable with Allah. You will be sinful.
Or what if, for argument's sake, that doesn't work?
Then
should they be disowned? Should that child be disowned?
If disowning them will change them, then they should be disowned. But if disowning them would make them worse, then you don't disown them. You still try convincing them. It depends on the level of deviancy it leads to. If it leads to more deviancy, then you keep them at the home, as long as they do not influence the other siblings and other people.
Okay.
For me, it's like having a drug dealer's son. What do you do with your drug dealer's son? A lot of us in the inner cities have to deal with drug dealers. We've got a bigger drug dealer problem than homosexuals.
Your final words, your final closing remark. Do you want to make anything?
My final closing remarks is that morality is judged by Allah.
Yeah.
And we follow the law of Allah. The law of man will change every 50 years. 50 years from now, there'll be new laws. You'll have new fluffies and new cozies and some other concepts.
But Islam won't change.
Islam is the way it was revealed. It will always remain as such.
Well, on that note, Sheikh Asrar Rashid, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.